Hi guys, so we're going to start with basically lymph node tissue. So the major functions of lymph node tissue are basically to house and provide proliferation sites for lymphocytes. So what that means is a place for them to multiply. Proliferation sites for lymphocytes. It also helps to offer surveillance vantage point for lymphocytes and macrophages as they filter through lymph. Macrophages. So the lymph tissue is largely composed of reticular connective tissue. And basically, as I showed previously in the last lecture, part one of this lecture, macrophages live on these reticular fibers. And the spaces between the fibers offer a place for the lymphocytes to occupy when they return from patrolling the body. And so lymph tissue is very important. Now, lymph tissue can combine to make lymph organs. So we're going to talk about some of the lymph organs that are present in the lymphatic system. So the primary organs, basically, are, sorry about that, the bone marrow, and the thymus. And so basically, when we're talking about the types of cells earlier, I talked about lymphocytes. And there are two types of lymphocytes. There's B lymphocytes and T lymphocytes. So these are also known as T and B cells. They originate in the bone marrow, but only B cells actually mature there. So both T and B cells originate, right, in the bone marrow and the thymus. But on here, basically, the T cells mature in the thymus and the B cells mature in the bone marrow. And these are what are called the primary lymph node organs. Now, secondary lymph node organs, these are areas where mature lymphocytes first encounter their antigen. So primary is basically where they're made and mature. Secondary is when they first start basically fighting. So you have here the nodes, the spleen, what we know as MALT, or mucosa-associated lymph node tissue, and diffuse lymph node tissue. So let's talk a little bit about these different types of tissue and organs. There are two main types of lymph node tissue. There's diffuse lymph node tissue, as I said. This is loose arrangements of lymphoid cells and some reticular cells. This is basically found in every body organ. And you find it in basically larger collections in the lamina propria, which is essentially the connective tissue under the epithelial layers of the mucosa membrane in body locations like the opening of the mouth or anus. Then you have what's known as lymphoid follicle or nodules. These are solid spherical bodies consisting of tightly packed lymphoid cells and reticular fiber. These have germinal centers for B cells, basically where they're proliferating. And so many form large part of lymph node organs. And you can find these in isolated aggregations of the pyres patches and in the appendix. So this is essentially where we can find the different lymphoid tissues and what they are composed of. Now, the different organs that we're looking at, let's talk about lymph nodes. These are principal secondary lymph node organs. They have hundreds of nodes that are found throughout the body. They're mostly embedded deep in connective tissue in clusters along lymphatic vessels. Some are near the body surface. And areas like the linguinal, axillary, or cervical regions of the body where collecting vessels converge into ducts. And so lymph node structures, they can vary in size and shape, but most of them are bean-like structures. They're very small. They're less than an inch or 2.5 centimeters. They're surrounded by capsules. And these capsular, basically these capsule fibers will extend inwards as kind of these trabeculae that divide nodes into compartments. And we're going to look at what this looks like. So let's actually look at the different areas that you can find these guys in. So you have the regional, so you can see these are the cervical nodes here that you look towards the back of the neck. Axillary that you can see there, armpit. Inguinal nodes are down there towards the hip region, right? And so those are basically the three main regional that you can see there. You can see they're small, tiny circles, kind of bean-like shape, and they help to drain. So again, they vary in shape and size, but most of them are bean shape, 2.5 centimeters, which is about less than an inch. And their two major functions are cleansing the lymph. So they act as a basically lymph filter. And so what happens in here are that macrophages help to remove and destroy microorganisms. And they help to remove and eliminate debris. This is important because it helps to prevent unwanted substances getting into the blood. They're also important in what's known as immune system activation. And what this basically just means is they're offering a place for lymph nodes, lymphocytes to become activated. And then they're able to mount an attack against antigens. So the lymph nodes are important in several different basically functions within the body, or within specifically the lymphatic system. So now let's look at the structures of a lymph node. So you can see it has two very distinct regions. And so let's start first. You have this superficial area. First, we have the cortex here, you can see. So in that region, you have both a superficial and you have a deep region in there. The superficial area basically contains what's known as the germinal centers. And if you remember what's happening there, think about germinal and what germ centers normally mean. This is where you're having B cells divide, lots of dividing B cells. The deep area of the cortex is going to house T cells. And basically, these are the guys that are in transit. T cells are always moving continuously, basically among blood, lymph nodes, and lymph, right? And so if you see the cortex here, right, the superficial is going to be towards the outside. And if you go, you can see here, the germinal centers are basically in this area right here. The lymph node follicle is around the outside. And this area towards the very outside is the subcapsular sinus area right here. And then the farther that you get into that area, right, you're going to have basically the area where the T cells are in transit. Now, if you're looking, the capsule is towards the outside here, and what emanates from the capsules are these trabeculae that will separate these small pyramids that you see within. Now, once you can see the center area here, which is known as the medulla. And the medulla essentially is going to basically contain B cells, T cells, and plasma cells. And so you can see here that this area right here is what's known as the medullary cord, and the pink area around it is the medullary sinus. And so this guy, the sinus, the lymphoid sinuses are found throughout. As you can see, you have the subcapsular sinus, and then you have the medullary sinus. So these lymph sinuses areas are found throughout the lymph. It's just depending on their location, they will have different prenames. Now the medulla is important because basically what's going to happen here is this is the area that contains the B cells, T cells, and plasma cells. It also consists of very large lymphatic capillaries spanned by crisscrossing these reticular fibers across. And basically, this is the area that macrophages will check and eat or phagocyze foreign matter. Okay. Now the only other thing that we know that the macrophages are down there along with the reticular cells. The lymphatic cells are everywhere. The one that we didn't talk is the dendritic cells, and they are abundant in basically the deep cortex. And they're basically, they help, remember, and so they're present, they help to allow the T cells or present antigens to the T cells. So basically, this is the area that will help prep them for that. And so the deep cortex helps to basically activate both types of lymphocytes. Now, when we talk about this, we want to talk about how lymph actually moves through the lymph node. So basically, let me do a different color here. Let's try purple. It's going to enter in here through these basically afferent lymphatic vesicles. And at this point, you'll notice it goes through this first area here, which is the subcapsular sinuses. And so it's going to go through that area. It's going to go into smaller sinuses throughout the cortex and the medulla, into the medullary sinuses, and it's finally going to leave out through the efferent lymphatic vesicles at the side of the hilum, right? So it enters in basically this convex side over here and goes through the lymph node as such. So just a reminder, it goes through the afferent to the subcapsular sinus, into smaller sinuses throughout the basically cortex and medulla, to the medullary sinuses. Finally, out the efferent lymphatic vessel at the hilum here. So basically, presence of fewer efferent vessels can cause flow to somewhat be stagnant. The good thing about this, because it's slower, it allows lymphocytes and macrophages time to function. So that can be good. And lymph basically travels through several nodes at one time, not just one single node. And so that can kind of give you the location. You can see the medullary sinus there, one of the last places it hits before it leaves. Okay. And so that's with the lymph nodes. Now, the spleen is also important in the lymphatic system. It's a blood-rich organ. It's about the size of a fist. It's located in the abdominal cavity just above or below the stomach. It's served by the splenic artery and vein, which enters and exits at the hilum. You can see that here in the picture. Now, it has several functions. It's the site of lymphatic proliferation and immune surveillance response. Proliferation and basically immune surveillance and response. I'm going to change to black up here. It's also important because it cleanses the blood of aged blood cells and platelets. And it helps the macrophage remove debris. It stores the broke down products of the red blood cells, for example, iron for later use. It stores blood platelets and monocytes for release when needed. And it may be the site of fetal erythrocyte production. This guy also has a fibrous capsule and also has trabeculae. And so you can see the spleen farther down, and we're kind of covering some of all the secondary lymph node organs right now. So we've done the thymus, we've done the red bone marrow, we've done lymph nodes, we've done tonsils, right? So basically when we go into, we're going to look a little bit at the histology of the spleen. So if you look in here, you can see that when we do a cut of the spleen, you can see the two different parts here, the two different tissues, right? So you have the white pulp, that's the site where immune function occurs. This actually contains, so it's this darker region that's around here. This actually contains lymphocytes. And this area that's out here is the red pulp, and that's a site where old blood cells and blood-borne pathogens are destroyed. Basically, red blood cells and macrophages that engulf them are located here. And so those are the different parts of the spleen. And we'll look again at that histology when we get into class. Now we have MALT, which is mucosa-associated lymphoid tissue. Now MALT is tissue that's found in that mucosa membrane throughout the body, and it helps to protects from pathogens trying to enter the body. And so it can be found in the respiratory tract, the general urinary organs, and digestive organs. And a large collection can be found in the tonsils, the pyre patches, and the appendix. And so we're going to look at this, these three different basically organs or that are part of the secondary lymph node system that contain MALT. So the tonsils basically are the simplest lymph node organ. Tonsils' function is basically to gather and remove pathogens that's in the food or the air. They contain follicles that actually have germinal centers and scattered lymphocytes. The tonsils actually form kind of a ring of lymphatic tissue that's around the pharynx. And so it kind of appears as swellings of mucosa. They're named according to their location, which we're going to look at here in a second, right? And basically they have these overlining epithelial invaginations that basically form what's called tonsillar crypts. And these crypts are going to allow bacteria and particulates to enter, where they can be essentially trapped and destroyed. So you can see here the very first one, they're named according to location. So you have the tubular tonsils here. You'll have the pharyngeal tonsils here, the lingual tonsils right over here, and the palatine tonsils here. And so the largest and the one that's most often affected is this guy right here, the palatine tonsils, right? And it's at the posterior end of the oral cavity. The lingual, you can think language, or it's at the base of the tongue. The pharyngeal, also known as the adenoids, are located at the posterior wall of the nasopharynx. And the tubule are basically surrounds openings of the auditory tubes into the pharynx. They are not fully encapsulated at all. And like I said, they form what are known as these little crypts. So there are these invaginations, or these kind of folds or cavities that bacteria or other particulate kind of matter enters, where they get trapped and destroyed. It's kind of risky to do this though, right? If you lure bacteria into a tissue, they can basically start, if it's moist, it's warm, they can start to multiply. But what this is it gets them in there and allows the immune cells to become activated and to build memory cells against these potential pathogens. So though it can kind of help to harbor bacteria and help them to start replicating, it's going to in the long term help our body to fight against them. We do have these pyre patches. These are aggregated lymph node nodules. They're clusters of lymph node follicles in the wall of the distal portion of the small intestines. They're similar in structure to tonsils, and they have basically their functions are to destroy bacteria, preventing them from breaching in the intestinal wall, and it helps to generate memory lymphocytes. So later on, if we're exposed to them again, that our body can get rid of them very quickly. And you can see those basically, and we'll look at these in class, these kind of follicles here of the pyre patches that are within the intestinal walls. And then we also have the appendix. It's an offshoot of the first part of the intestines, right? It contains a large number of the lymphoid follicles. And location aids in function, just like the pyre patches. They help to destroy and preventing them from bacteria from breaching into the intestinal walls, and it also helps to generate memory lymphocytes. And basically the last one we're going to be talking about today is the thymus. And the thymus functions as a lymph node organ where T cells can mature. The thymus basically is different from other lymph node organs in very important ways. For instance, it has no follicles because it lacks B cells. It does not directly fight antigens. It basically functions strictly in taking T cells and helping them mature. The stroma is made up of epithelial cells, not reticular cells. So this is going to provide an environment which T lymphocytes become immunocompetent, right? You're not going to have a bunch of these macrophages everywhere, helping to activate. This guy is most active and the largest in size during childhood. It stops growing during adolescence and then starts going through atrophy. So this is really important why as a functional lymphatic organ when you're younger. It still will produce these immunocompetent cells. As we get older, it just does it slowly. So this is important because it contains what's known as a blood-thymus barrier. And what that does is it keeps immature T cells isolated and away from antigens. So you are not going to get premature activation here. So this is the structure of the thymus. As you can see, the cortex, or that outside part, has rapidly dividing lymphocytes and scattered macrophages here. So here you have the capsule. Here's the cortex in here. And the medulla is here in this area. And the medulla contains fewer lymphocytes and thymic corpuscles, or regulatory T cells. So this is the type of T cell that helps to prevent the autoimmunity. So we have some homeostatic imbalances here. So lymphangitis is a condition in which the lymphatic vessels appear as painful red lines under the skin. And basically it's caused by inflammation of larger lymphatic vessels. And basically these larger vessels contain what's known as vasora. And this is just small blood vessels that supply large blood vessel blood. So it's a condition. It's just an inflammatory condition. Buboes, which are otherwise known as swollen glands. And this is just a way to talk about inflamed, swollen, tendered lymph nodes. And this happens when nodes are overwhelmed by what they are trying to destroy. They basically can be pusful. And this is where bubonic plague got its name from. This is one of the phenotypes that you would see. Lymphedema is localized edema. And this is by anything that prevents the return of lymph to blood. So examples here, tumors may be blocking lymphatics or a removal of lymphatics during cancer surgery. Basically, lymphedema may improve if some lymphatic pathways remain and enlarge. Now, cancer. Lymph nodes are considered a secondary cancer site. If the cancer cells can metastasize, and essentially those cancer cells can become trapped in the lymph nodes itself. Cancer infiltrates lymph nodes, and when they do that, the lymph nodes are normally swollen, but not as painful. So it's a fact that can help distinguish cancerous nodules from those infected by microorganisms, because the microorganisms tend to be extremely painful, where cancer, once it starts collecting in the lymph nodes, it hurts, but it's not as painful as when you have an infection. Splenectomy is a surgical removal of a ruptured spleen. So the spleen has a very thin capsule, so a direct blow or severe infection may cause it to rupture, something like we were talking about with mononucleosis, and the spilling blood can go into the peritoneal cavity. So basically, one standard treatment to prevent hemorrhaging and shock, but it was discovered spleen can actually repair itself. So the frequency of these emergency removal has decreased drastically. If the spleen must be removed, the liver and bone marrow take over its function. And children under 12, the spleen will actually regenerate if a small part is left. So, guys, that's basically the end of the lymphatic system. So we will talk to you guys later.